used to think that history was boring. At least I thought studying it in school was. Although I always loved historical fiction, books, and movies. I know this might be an unpopular opinion in this room, that history courses are kind of uninteresting. But it's true for me. In high school, my history classes were each based on one giant tome of a textbook, which presented information in an unquestionable, unengaging format. I lugged the books around hopelessly, trying to convince myself to read them, and I usually failed to do so. I remember sitting in my school's library, willing myself to take notes, to make flashcards, to memorize the facts. You might have already caught a hint of what I'm saying. I was missing a way to engage with history, a way to question it, a way to be in conversation. This past semester in graduate school, I was reading a lot about the Salem witch trials. And so in a previously unimaginably engaging history course called Witch Hunts, Persecution in Public History and Ethics, we had lively and intriguing conversations about stories. These stories weren't so much a fixed part of the past, but a live thing, something slippery and growing around us still. And in that class, I imagined myself in the conversations about the decisions which make up our known history. My classmates and I mentally placed ourselves in those impossible situations, knowing that those conversations were had by rooms of real people who I'll never quite understand. This did more than present a thought exercise about how people used to live, which to me usually ends up allowing me to distance myself from them. Ew, how did people in history stay clean? I could never live like that. Instead, by engaging with those thorny ethical questions in their own historical context, I was able to think outside of my everyday life. This kind of conversation allows us to imagine who we might be in a moment of real moral quandary, of uncertain truth, of ethical grayness. We can pry ourselves off of the paths we walk each day and into a new way of understanding. And so in that course, we started to talk about Salem by reading a book by Emerson Baker, which presents a complicated situation in a complicated way. I imagine most of us in this room know what happened in Salem, and I also imagine that most of us consider it a tragedy. In 1692, the judicial system in the Massachusetts Bay Colony wrongly executed 19 people, mostly women, and imprisoned more than 100 under accusation of witchcraft. That same system eventually developed into the one we live under right now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Luckily, I'm not here to talk about that system, the judicial one, or even if its judges convicted those innocent people out of a sincere belief that they were all practicing witches. I'm also not really here to talk about how that conflict came to an end, or the havoc wreaked on the lives of everyday people of Salem and the surrounding area, or the fear that grew in the surrounding community. I'm actually here to talk a little bit about what happened in the years after the wrong was done and unable to be undone. I want to investigate how we live with it, how we might grapple with atonement and forgiveness and hope for a new way forward. Yes, Salem was a tragedy, but it was a tragic year in a time of anxiety, bitterness, theological uncertainty, a time of hope of a different life beginning to unravel. Puritans really took seriously their covenant with God, their understanding that they were God's chosen people, chosen to be saved, to build this beacon of righteousness in a world that was new to them, at least. So by the generation of the witch trials, this had begun to unravel a little bit. Their children were less theologically observant. War had put tremendous pressure on their economy. Food ran scarce. I am not able to absolve anyone of responsibility for their actions, and I'm not trying to present false heroes in a human-made crisis, but instead, I want to make sure that we see the tragedy as a hurricane of mistakes and the kind of cruelty which comes with fear. So in the 4 years after quiet had settled back over the colony for the most part, more tragedies began to befall the families of those prominently involved with the prosecution. To those people of faith, this felt like a sign from God of wrongdoing. And ultimately, only one of them would come forward and ask for forgiveness. In the spring of 1696, Samuel Sewall, who had been one of the 6 judges in the trials, and he was a man with significant political power, gave his minister, Reverend Samuel Willard, an apology letter to be read in front of the congregation at South Church, just right across the river in Boston. It came to be known as Sewall's Apology, and it reads, in part, Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has an unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all his other sins. Before this public statement, there had been no admission of responsibility by any of the involved parties or wrongdoing. Sewall, in a moment of humility consistent with the Puritan theology of the time, admitted to the gravity of his mistakes and sought absolution, both from God, to whom he ascribed absolute power, but also from his faith community, from whom he asked forgiveness. To our modern eyes, this feels a little incomplete. Sewall went on to face no consequences in his career for his role in the trials. Yet many in his life noted that he was never able to forgive himself. He wore a hair shirt, a shirt made of human hair, as a symbol of his shame under his clothing for the rest of his life. Sewall is not a hero, not a villain, but a man responsible for so much harm, who tried to find a way to live with it. I want a better life for all of us. Not punishment, but accountability. Not shame, but real forgiveness. Not to point fingers at those in the past and laugh at their foolishness, but to take a moment to place ourselves in their shoes. Not a call for pardon from God, but for compassion and grace from our community, who know that we are divine. When we read stories of historical violence, we have no choice but to lament, for they touch us to this day. At Halloween, crowds gather in Salem to celebrate the joy of magic, to delight in the possibility of transformation. I think this might be a kind of lamentation, too. We read stories of violence which is happening now, and we grieve, and we must know ourselves to be alive in this moment and hold one another more closely, and then we must reach out. When we allow ourselves to sit with these stories of complex tragedies of the past, we make space for moving on in a new way. We make space for stories of reconciliation not yet told. We make space for narratives of how the violence almost continued, past our knowledge of how we knew it ended. We make space for the wisdom which surely kept more tragedies from happening, because violence is not inevitable. We make space for those moments of turning points, for our own agency and imagination. We make space for saying, I'm sorry, this is not good enough. We can do better. We can forgive ourselves and each other. We can begin again in love. Emerson Baker says later on his book on Salem that Americans today gaze back at the people of 1692 as a foolish, superstitious, and intolerant lot. How could they possibly have executed 19 people as witches? Yet, that is to dismiss the figure in the mirror. Imagine for a moment the situation they faced and consider the quandary from their perspective. Wanting to protect what they held most dear, they tore it apart. I think our fascination with the witch trials endures because of our commitment to try to be on the right side of history, despite the reality that we only know so much about the moral standards future generations will hold for us. Prejudice doesn't so much rear its head as underlie the ground most of our institutions are built on. The death penalty is still legal federally and being used to execute innocent people every year. For me, much of the work of putting myself in the shoes of past and future generations is about building a world that is a little better, one step at a time. My hope is that this will allow our planet to survive and that our descendants will see us as fallible humans and forgive us the errors we are sure to make. We can forgive ourselves and each other. We can begin again in love, and we are blessed to start today.